It's strange how loneliness can sneak into your life, as silent as the evening shadows that stretch across a quiet room. For me, it wasn't a sudden realization but a slow unraveling. I remember one particular evening, David had promised to be home for dinner. I had prepared his favorite dish, lit a candle on the dining table for ambience, and even put on a dress I hadn't worn in years. By the time the food had grown cold, the candle had burned halfway, and I was sitting there, staring at my phone, wondering if he would even remember to call. David wasn't always like this. When we first married, he was attentive, present, and so in love with me that it felt like I was the center of his universe. He'd call me just to hear my voice, hold my hand as if it were a lifeline, and whisper dreams of our future together late into the night. But somewhere along the way, his dreams became bigger than us. I understood, of course. His business demanded his time, his energy, his everything. I tried to be supportive, cheering for every promotion, milestone, and achievement. Yet, with each step up the ladder, it felt like he was stepping further away from me. Nights became the hardest. I'd lie in bed, listening to the distant murmur of his voice as he paced in his study, taking yet another late-night call. I'd drift off to sleep alone, the spot beside me cold and empty. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, hoping he'd finally joined me, only to hear the faint clatter of a keyboard downstairs. The silence between us wasn't just physical. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and shared secrets, had dwindled into practical exchanges about bills and schedules. I'd look at him across the table during breakfast, wanting to tell him about my day, my thoughts, my fears, but he was always in a rush, his mind already in the office, his phone buzzing with endless notifications. I started filling the emptiness in other ways. I took up gardening, volunteering, even joined a book club. But nothing quite filled the void. It wasn't companionship I was missing, it was him. One day, I found an old photo album tucked away in the attic. As I flipped through the pages, tears pricked my eyes. There we were, younger versions of ourselves, smiling, holding hands, looking at each other with the kind of love that feels invincible. I traced my fingers over the pictures, wondering when we had stopped being those people. I loved David, I still do. But love isn't just about feeling, it's about presence, effort, and connection. And that's what I was missing. My life had become a carefully maintained routine, a series of motions without emotion. I felt like a ghost in my own home, haunting a life I once cherished. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I made a silent wish, for something to change, for the warmth to return, for the loneliness to finally go away. What I didn't know was that change was already on its way, just not in the way I could have ever expected. The house felt different the day Ethan moved back in. Not just fuller, but warmer, as though his presence had brought a glow to the corners long left cold by David's absence. Ethan had always been polite and thoughtful, a young man with a quiet confidence that set him apart. But now, at 24, he wasn't just David's son. He was his own person, a blend of charm and maturity that made him stand out in a way I hadn't anticipated. It started innocently, as most things do. Need a hand with that? Ethan's voice broke through the silence as I struggled to carry a box of groceries from the car. I hadn't even heard him come outside. Thank you, I said, grateful as he took the heavier bags from my hands. No problem. It's nice to feel useful, he replied with a grin, his boyish dimples catching me off guard. That was Ethan. Always kind, always willing to help. At first, it felt like a relief, having someone around to fill the quiet spaces of my day. He'd offer to fix things around the house or sit with me over coffee, asking questions that made me feel seen. How have you been, Laura? He asked one morning, his tone earnest. The question caught me off guard. How was I? When was the last time anyone had asked me that? I'm fine, I replied automatically, then hesitated. It's been quiet, I guess. His eyes softened. Quiet can be lonely sometimes. I didn't reply, but his words lingered long after he'd left the room. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a regular part of my routine. We'd cross paths in the kitchen, share meals when David worked late, and chat about everything and nothing. He had a way of listening that felt deliberate, as though he cared about every word I said. It was a stark contrast to the distant nods I'd grown used to from David. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, I found myself opening up to Ethan in a way I hadn't with anyone in years. Marriage isn't what I thought it would be, I admitted, staring at the horizon. Ethan didn't look at me with pity or judgment, just understanding. I think a lot of people feel that way. We build these ideas in our heads, and when reality doesn't match, it's hard. His words felt like a balm to wounds I hadn't realized were still open. You're wise for your age, I said, attempting to lighten the mood. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Or maybe I just have good instincts. As the days passed, I began to notice more about Ethan, the way he carried himself, the way his smile lingered a beat too long when we talked. And slowly, something shifted. It wasn't love, not in the way I'd felt for David once upon a time. But it was connection, and in the vast emptiness I'd been living in, that connection felt like a lifeline. The knock on the door was soft but startling, breaking the silence I'd been lost in. I turned to see Ethan standing there, his eyes hesitant but kind, framed by the warm glow of the hallway light. Laura, is it okay if I come in? He asked, his voice gentle, careful, as though he sensed my unease before I did. It wasn't unusual for Ethan to stop by to talk, but tonight felt different. There was something in the way his eyes lingered, searching mine for permission, for connection. Of course, I said, tying the sash of my robe a little tighter, hoping to steady the nervous energy that suddenly flooded me. Ethan stepped into the room, his movements deliberate, but there was no tension between us, just a quiet familiarity. He sat on the edge of the chair by the window, his presence both calming and electrifying. I hope I'm not interrupting, he began, resting his elbows on his knees. You're not, I replied quickly. Too quickly. He smiled faintly, nodding, before his expression grew thoughtful. You seemed, I don't know, a little off tonight. Are you okay? His question caught me off guard. It had been years since anyone had asked me that with genuine concern. Not as a casual greeting or polite check-in, but as a real inquiry, as though my well-being mattered. I'm fine, I said, forcing a small laugh. Just one of those days. Laura, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made me meet his gaze. You don't have to pretend with me. And just like that, the dam broke. I found myself pouring out pieces of my life I hadn't shared with anyone, not even with myself. The loneliness, the feeling of being invisible in my own home, the ache of wanting more but not knowing how to ask for it. Ethan listened, his eyes steady and attentive, as though every word mattered to him. I don't know, I finished, laughing weakly through the tears I hadn't realized were falling. I guess that's what happens after 10 years of marriage. You just disappear. You haven't disappeared, he said firmly, his voice low but certain. Not to me. The words hung in the air between us, their weight pressing down on me in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. You're kind, Ethan, I said, shaking my head, trying to deflect the vulnerability I felt creeping in. But you don't have to say that. It's not kindness, he said, leaning forward. It's the truth. You're incredible, Laura. I see it every day. My heart fluttered in a way it hadn't in years. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the world outside had paused just for us. For the first time in so long, I felt visible, alive. We sat there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, the walls between us crumbling with each passing moment. By the time Ethan rose to leave, the weight of loneliness had lifted, replaced by something I didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. And as he turned to glance back at me before closing the door, I felt it, a spark of something I hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. I never thought a single moment could redefine the boundaries of my life, but that's exactly what happened. It started with a quiet evening, the kind that stretched endlessly, filled with a silence that wasn't peaceful but suffocating. David was still in his study, and I sat in our dimly lit bedroom, staring blankly at the shadows dancing on the walls. The knock on the door was so soft I almost missed it. "Come in," I said, thinking it might be David, though that was wishful thinking. When the door creaked open, Ethan stepped in, his presence filling the room in a way that felt too natural, too comforting. He hesitated in the doorway, his hand resting on the knob, looking as though he wasn't sure he should be there. "Is everything okay?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Yeah, he paused, his eyes meeting mine. "I thought you might want some company. You looked upset earlier." I wanted to brush it off, to say I was fine, but the words caught in my throat. For years, I had swallowed my feelings, buried my frustrations beneath a facade of composure. Yet here Ethan stood, seeing through me, offering the solace I hadn't realized I was desperate for. "Come in," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped forward and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly as though he was nervous. It struck me how much he reminded me of a younger David, before the career, before the distance. Ethan was the David I used to know, the man I had fallen in love with. We began to talk. At first, it was small talk, his day, his plans, the usual surface-level exchanges. But as the minutes ticked by, the conversation deepened. I found myself telling him things I hadn't even admitted to myself, how lonely I felt, how invisible I had become in my own marriage, and how much I missed being truly seen. Ethan listened, his gaze steady and filled with empathy. He didn't interrupt or try to offer solutions, he simply let me speak. And for the first time in years, I felt understood. "You don't deserve to feel that way," he said finally, his voice low but firm. I looked at him, startled by the conviction in his tone. "You're an incredible woman, Laura. Anyone who doesn't see that is blind." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with something I couldn't name. My heart pounded in my chest as his words hung between us, daring me to respond. "Ethan," I began, but my voice faltered. He reached out then, brushing a stray curl away from my face. The touch was so soft, so tender, that it sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, caught between the pull of his warmth and the voice in my head screaming that this was wrong. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, pulling his hand back. "I didn't mean to." But before he could finish, I leaned forward, my lips brushing against his. It was a tentative kiss, hesitant and filled with uncertainty, but it ignited something deep within me, a spark that had long been buried beneath years of neglect. Ethan pulled back, his eyes searching mine. This isn't right," he said, his voice barely audible. "I know," I whispered, my breath shaky. "But it doesn't feel wrong." In that moment, the weight of everything, my loneliness, my longing, my guilt, collapsed under the intensity of what I felt. I kissed him again, this time with more urgency, and he responded with a passion that matched my own. The world outside that room ceased to exist. There was no David, no societal expectations, no consequences, only the two of us, lost in a moment that felt as inevitable as it was forbidden. But as our connection deepened, a sliver of fear crept in. This was a line I could never uncross, a choice that would forever change the trajectory of our lives. And yet, in that moment, all I could feel was the overwhelming need to hold on to the warmth Ethan offered, the warmth I had been missing for far too long. I never thought guilt could feel so suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest every second of the day. It wasn't just about what Ethan and I had done, it was the lies, the stolen glances, the deceit woven into the fabric of my every moment. Every time David smiled at me, asked me how my day was, or even just sat next to me on the couch, it was like a dagger twisting deeper into my heart. And yet, I couldn't stop. Ethan and I had created a world for ourselves, a fragile, secret world where time stopped and we were free to feel. Those moments, stolen in the quiet corners of our home, were intoxicating. I'd never felt so alive, so seen, and yet so horribly lost all at once. One particular afternoon, I stood in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic chop of the knife should have been comforting, mundane even, but my hands trembled. David was at work, and Ethan had just walked in from the backyard, a faint sheen of sweat glistening on his brow from mowing the lawn. He leaned against the counter, his gaze piercing through me in a way that made my breath catch. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. I shook my head, unable to meet his eyes. The tension was unbearable. How had we gotten here? A few months ago, he was just Ethan, David's son, someone I cared for but never considered in this light. Now, his presence was electric, the air between us crackling with everything we couldn't say. "Laura," he said, stepping closer. I froze, the knife clattering onto the counter. "Ethan, don't," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "I can't help it," he replied, his hand brushing against mine. "You're all I think about." His words sent a thrill through me, but they also filled me with dread. I jerked my hand away, stepping back as tears burned my eyes. "This has to stop," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't keep doing this. It's not fair to David, or to ourselves." Ethan's face fell, the confidence I'd always admired in him crumbling into vulnerability. "But what about us?" he asked. "Doesn't this mean anything to you?" "It does," I admitted, my voice breaking. "More than I want it to. But it's wrong. We're living a lie, Ethan, and it's tearing me apart." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of my words hanging heavily between us. I could see the pain in his eyes, a mirror of my own, and it nearly undid me. "I don't want to hurt you," I whispered. "And I don't want to lose you," he said. But deep down, I knew we already had. That night, as I lay in bed beside David, the familiar ache of guilt settled over me. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I'd let my life spiral so far out of control. There were no easy answers, no way to undo what had been done. All I knew was that the shadows we were hiding in were growing darker, and sooner or later, they would swallow us whole. I heard David's footsteps before I saw him, each one falling heavy and deliberate against the polished floor. My heart raced, the sound thudding in my ears like a countdown to a moment I wasn't ready to face. There was no time to adjust, no way to hide the emotions that threatened to spill over. "Laura," his voice called softly, tinged with both exhaustion and familiarity as he stepped into the living room. "How was your day?" I looked up from the book I was pretending to read, my fingers gripping its edges so tightly they turned white. His eyes met mine, warm but searching, as though he could sense something was amiss. And in that moment, I felt my carefully constructed facade start to crack. It was fine, I replied, my voice too high, too quick. Just, quiet. David set his briefcase down and loosened his tie, his presence filling the room in a way I hadn't felt in years. There was an undeniable weight to the silence that followed, and I struggled to meet his gaze. I wasn't sure what he saw when he looked at me, his wife of over a decade, or someone he couldn't quite recognize anymore. You seem distant lately, he said, sitting on the edge of the couch beside me. His words were careful, measured, as if he'd been rehearsing them in his mind for days. Is everything okay? The question hung in the air, so simple yet so impossibly loaded. My throat tightened, and for a fleeting second, I considered telling him everything. The loneliness, the resentment, the forbidden connection with Ethan that had filled the void he left behind. But the thought of the hurt and betrayal that would cross his face stopped me cold. I'm just tired, I said instead, forcing a smile that felt brittle. I think I need a little more sleep, that's all. David's brow furrowed, and he reached out to take my hand in his. His touch was gentle, familiar, but it didn't set my heart racing the way Ethan's did. It only reminded me of what we'd lost, what I'd lost. Laura, if there's something you need to talk about, I'm here, he said softly, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. I know I've been busy, but you can tell me anything. You know that, right? I nodded, unable to form words. His sincerity should have comforted me, but instead, it made the guilt more unbearable. I didn't deserve his concern, his kindness. Not after what I'd done. As he leaned back into the couch, I excused myself, mumbling something about needing a shower. Once upstairs, I locked the bathroom door and let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the sink for support. Tears pricked my eyes, a mixture of shame, regret, and the undeniable truth that I couldn't undo what had already been set in motion. I stared at my reflection, searching for a trace of the woman I used to be, the woman who would never have let her marriage deteriorate to this point. But she was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Downstairs, I could hear David moving about, his voice faint as he made a call, perhaps to a client. The sound was a bitter reminder of the life we had built, a life now standing on fragile ground. I didn't know how much longer I could keep up the charade, but one thing was clear, the storm I feared was no longer looming, it was already here.